Good morning, everyone. This is Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com in the ReliefFactor.com studio, Texas style, filling in for Hugh on the Hugh Hewitt Show. If you're like me, you went to bed last night and the world was mostly at peace. You're waking up this morning with Russia committing an act of war and aggression on Ukraine. We are going to be covering the news. We've got lots to discuss in the next 3 hours. We've got some great guests coming up. Later on this hour, we'll have Dr. Michael Oren on to talk a little bit about Vladimir Putin's speech. We'll also have Josh Kraushaar on. We'll have Josh Rogin to talk about the analysis. But I think in this first hour, we're really going to try to focus on the news of what's going on right now. Last night, Vladimir Putin declared war on Ukraine. There is an invasion going on from multiple directions, including Belarus, even though Belarus is at the moment denying that Russian troops are using Belarus as a staging point for the invasion. The Russian military has penetrated to the outskirts of Kharkiv, apparently, Kharkiv being the second largest city in Ukraine. Explosions can be heard in Kharkiv, in Kiev. This is a large-scale assault on Ukraine. This is not an incremental move. This is a very bold move by Vladimir Putin, and the world reaction has been fairly united on this. Even China is suggesting, at least somewhat with some nuance, that perhaps it would be better if people didn't invade. And that people return to real diplomacy, although China took the opportunity to criticize the West over this. Apparently, Ukraine is already reporting at least 40 casualties. They are calling civilians to city centers to be assigned weapons for common defense. You have reporters who are now trapped in Kiev, in Kharkiv, who are suddenly war correspondents and trying to report out from there. Let's go to cut number 21. This is from CNN last night with Don Lemon and Matthew Chance reporting on the invasion.
Yeah, Don, I mean, look, I'm going to bring you those reports in a minute, but there's been some really, really loud explosions when you were talking to Nick just a minute ago, much closer, just to the east of us here. You know, really feeling the vibrations. So obviously, you know, the vibrations, obviously those attacks, those missile strikes coming in much closer. And here's the sort of news that we've got from you, defense officials saying that this is now, and this is a quote I'm getting from the president's office at the moment, a full-blown nationwide attack with military infrastructure that is being attacked nationwide. So the emphasis being on the military infrastructure that they say is coming under attack. We've also spoken to, again, our contact at the Interior Ministry, an Interior Ministry official, saying that across the country, as a result of these attacks, there are hundreds of casualties. Now, we don't know how many of those people are dead, how many are injured, or whether that figure is accurate. But we do know that the Interior Ministry of Ukraine is putting the number of casualties so far in this nationwide assault, missile assault at this stage, for the most part, in the hundreds, which is, you know, I mean, incredibly alarming. Obviously, if it's indeed accurate. But, you know, I can tell you, we've heard about, 18, 19 salvos of cruise missile attacks in just this city, in the capital, Kiev, within the past hour or so, since we've been talking to you here on CNN. And those attacks have been focused on, it seems, the air infrastructure here. There may have been other locations targeted as well, but definitely a couple of airports have been targeted. We've seen images of Borispil Airport, the main international airport that's been attacked. There will be surface-to-air missile stations there and military personnel stationed there. But then there's that Vasilkiv Air Base, about 20 miles to the north, where we have heard multiple strikes taking place over the course of the past 15 or 20 minutes. And there's going to be quite a few soldiers, quite a few military personnel, rather, that are located there. Not just the pilots, but also the crews and the technical staff that go with that. And so we're trying to get some more clarity on that. But again, the Interior Ministry of Ukraine saying that nationwide there are hundreds of casualties as a result of these Russian missile attacks, Don.
Hundreds of attacks. There's much more going on here as well. That, again, was Matthew Chance on CNN last night with Don Lemon. You can see, if you're in the universe, you can see the clip. And he is in full battle protective gear while reporting from a high point in Kiev. There's been other reports of assaults. We're going to get to more clips later on this hour. Just to bring you up to date as to what I'm seeing coming across the wire here. Apparently, there's a report now that Ukrainian officials have said that they have repelled a Russian helicopter airborne landing attempt at the Hostomel military airport just outside Kiev. So this is Russians are attempting to land airborne troops into the capital. This is something, and we're going to talk about what Marco Rubio predicted last night, probably in the next segment. But this is not a joke. This is not a border issue. This is not a response to some sort of pretext or provocation. This is a fully planned.
This is not a minor incursion.
This is no minor incursion. Exactly, Dwayne Patterson. This is no minor incursion. This is a serious war. Vladimir Putin has declared war on Ukraine. And if you listen to that speech last night, or if you happen to read that speech last night, there's no doubt as to what he has in mind for Ukraine. He wants to wipe out Ukraine's independence. He wants to bring Ukraine back into the Russian Federation. And we're going to talk to Dr. Michael Oren about one particular comment he made about Ukraine needing denazification, which is a very troubling comment and might have even more insight into Vladimir Putin's thinking on this. We're coming up to a break, so I don't want to necessarily get too close into another clip at the moment. But we are going to be looking at what happened last night at the UN Security Council. This attack was actually launched while the UN Security Council was meeting to try to come up with a diplomatic solution to this. In one of the great ironies of history, that meeting was being chaired by Russia, because it is Russia's turn to preside over the UN Security Council, and Russia essentially sandbagged the UN Security Council on this invasion. It is a stunning turn of events here. There's more reports coming out of about checkpoints being set up around Kharkiv. We're going to take a look later, I think, at the stock market. Stock market futures are now down 780 points, down 2.5%, roughly 2.5%. The futures are down across the board. Dwayne mentioned on social media that this basically, if this is the way it plays out once the markets open, this basically will wipe out all the market gains since March 31st. And let's not forget that we've had runaway inflation for most of that period. So some of those gains were inflationary to begin with. So this is probably a larger setback than what we might have, what the actual numbers actually mean here. Oil, on the other hand, is up. It crossed the $100 a barrel line early or overnight, but it's back down to just under $100 a barrel at the moment. So you have investors starting to protect themselves from the fallout of this war. We also have NATO calling a meeting, an emergency meeting, and we have all sorts of reaction from Washington, D.C., including members of both parties now calling for tougher sanctions on Vladimir Putin, on Russia, on Putin's oligarchical support in Moscow. There is just a ton of news going on at the moment. We're going to cover all of that in this hour, probably the next hour as well. Then we'll get to more analysis in the third hour here on the Hugh Hewitt Show. So we are going to be jam-packed here. And when we come back, we're going to be taking a look at some of these clips here that give us a little bit of background. We're going to be talking about the reaction at the UN Security Council from Ukraine's ambassador there. Later in the hour, we'll be talking about Marco Rubio's prediction, what it's going to look like. So far, he's been proven right. So stay tuned for that. I'm Ed Morrissey from HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm Ed Morrissey, filling in for Hugh, and joining us right now is our good friend, Dr. Michael Oren, former Israeli Deputy Prime Minister for Diplomacy and former U.S. Israeli Ambassador to the U.S. Dr. Oren, welcome back to the Hugh Hewitt Show.
Always good to be with you. Good day.
It's very difficult day, obviously, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I wanted to ask you specifically about the accusation that Ukraine needed to be denazified. In Vladimir Putin's speech last night, he made that pretty bizarre claim. And for context, for listeners who don't already know this, President Vladimir Zelensky is Jewish. So this is it's a very strange, bizarre claim, and I'm wondering if that gives you any insight into what Vladimir Putin is thinking right now.
Yeah, I think it does. And it made all the headlines here, that remark. And then, of course, the irony of it that this country that has a Jewish leadership would be called a Nazi country. It shows where the Russians are. For the Russians, Nazi is the ultimate evil. And that's their historical memory. They're not necessarily associating Nazism with anti-Semitism. Putin has never been anti-Semitic. In fact, he's very close to his former German teacher, who was a Jewish woman who now lives in Israel. And it's unusual, for an Eastern European leader never ever to make something, a remark that never be construed as anti-Semitic. So, yeah, it's just part of their Weltanschauung. It's Putin's worldview, which is a worldview in which Russia is not respected enough, where Russia is not living out its destiny, but will live out its destiny, where the West is a constant existential threat. It's all part of that.
Well, I think it's a leftover from World War II, and I think that maybe we maybe undersell this here, but some Ukrainians were collaborating with Nazi Germany because they hated the Russians, right? I mean, this is in Ukraine. The Western Ukrainians had gone through the Holodomor and saw the Nazis, at least in the beginning, as liberators and allied with them to push the Russians back into Russia proper. I think that memory is long and bitter in Russia, and probably especially with Putin.
Indeed. There was a Ukrainian SS. They're talking about the Nazis killed 20 million Russians. No small thing, and they remember that.
Right.
You go, the memorials in Russia are all for the Great Patriotic War of 1941 and 1945. Yes, it's all there, and even Israel and the Jewish people have a very tortured relationship with Ukraine. My own family comes from Ukraine. My grandparents came from Ukraine. They didn't think of themselves as Ukrainians. They thought themselves as Russian Jews. They spoke Russian. And yeah, a very complex history. And it's all part of building the case. Obviously, there's sort of a syllogism. If the Ukraine is guilty of genocide against Russians, because that's what Putin is claiming, and the Nazis are genocidal, therefore the Ukraine must be Nazi. Get it? And that's the type of the philosophical leap that Putin is making.
Dr. Oren, you're steeped in diplomacy. A breaking news item here this morning is that Turkey has called on Russia to stop an unjust and unlawful war. Are you surprised to see Turkey standing up to Putin in this regard? Turkey is a country that has grown much closer, I think, than some NATO members would have liked to Putin over the last few years.
Yeah, and it's also that Turkey's also bought very advanced Russian anti-aircraft systems, which is not consistent with Turkey's position in NATO. But the Turks are also scared of the Russians. They're traditionally scared of the Russians. As an historian, I'll remember the Crimean War of 1850 to 1853, in which Turkey aligned with Britain and France to prevent Russia from taking over the Dardanelles Straits and moving its Black Sea fleet out into the Mediterranean. That's their constant fear. A couple of years ago, the Turks also shot down a Russian jet, a fighter jet, and caused a major crisis. And the Turks are afraid. And afraid now that Russia now is very aggressive. Russia is on the march militarily. America is retreating. And one of the sort of side effects we've seen is a sudden reach out by Mr. Erdogan to Israel. He's invited our president, Isaac Herzog, for a visit. Looks like it's going to happen. He's scared. He's scared by the Russians' militarism. He's scared by the success of the Abraham Accords in this region, which are basically against against Iran, but also against the Muslim Brotherhood, which is backed by Turkey. Yeah, Mr. Erdogan is scared.
Dr. Oren, what do you think Vladimir Putin's endgame is here? I mean, it's honestly, I suspected that what he really wanted was a partition so he could claim to be the champion of Russian ethnic communities. We got about 30 seconds. What do you think is Putin's endgame here?
The short game is to move NATO away from Russia's borders. The long game is to change the world order, a world order which we saw established in 1989 with the fall of Soviet communism, and America was the preeminent superpower. That's going to change now, and Putin has set that as his historical goal and destiny.
Dr. Oren, I couldn't agree with you more. It's exactly what I think Putin is up to, and you can find out more from at Dr. Oren, right, on Twitter is where people can follow you.
All right. Have a good day.
Have a good day, Dr. Oren. Thank you very much for being with us. When we come back, we're going to continue following the war in Ukraine all 3 hours today. Maybe in the next hour, we're going to talk a little bit more about the American response, the potential American response, the NATO response. NATO is already moving assets to their eastern frontier. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh. Stay tuned. Welcome back. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com from the ReliefFactor.com studios here in Texas, filling in for Hugh on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Joining us now is former Senator Jim Talent, now Senior Fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, on Twitter at Jim Talent. Senator Talent, welcome back.
Thank you, Ed. We have an interesting situation this morning, don't we?
We certainly do. The latest news I saw is that they've confirmed a breakthrough in Russian breakthrough north of Kiev. So obviously Russian forces coming in from Belarus, which is the shortest route to Kiev, goes through the Chernobyl area, which should be very interesting to see the effects of that. What are our next steps here? I mean, we tried to do this sort of incremental approach to sanctions, I guess in the hope of offering Vladimir Putin some off-ramps. That clearly didn't deter him from a massive invasion today. What do we do next?
Well, first of all, we have learned that economic power does not deter kinetic aggression.
Right.
We've also learned that aggressors may be willing to launch a mechanized invasion, even if everybody in the West really doesn't want them to. So hopefully we have learned that lesson, at least for the time being. We are not prepared to deal with the consequences of this from a military point of view. So we pulled together whatever forces we have. I think Admiral Stavridis talks about that. We position them both as a deterrent, but also to signal that we're coming in with other things. We begin producing energy in this country to reduce his leverage. We hit him with every sanction we've got, and the president should scrap his 2023 defense budget submission and ask for an increase in the defense budget that's 5% above the rate of inflation, which would be probably about
13%? 13% increase?
Yeah, well, 10 to 12%, which would move us up in the $850 billion range. We can stop the bleeding in the Army. The Army's had pretty flat budgets the last couple of years, and then when you add inflation to that, it's had to cancel modernization programs. It's too small. We don't have much heavy armor in Eastern Europe. We have one heavy armor brigade we can pull together. It's about 5,000 men, 150 tanks, and another we pre-positioned equipment. They're moving those people in there, and they're moving light infantry and airborne in there. So we're now where we've often been in the past, because we just assumed that we could weaken our defenses and nobody would do anything about it, and they did. And we're going to be in the same position in Taiwan if we don't do anything in the next couple of years.
You know, Senator Talent, talk about this being a lesson learned about aggression. Why wasn't this lesson learned in 2008? I mean, you had a nearly identical set of circumstances, right? You had Russian invades Georgia. They peel off South Ossetia and Abkhazia as so-called independent states. They're still there. Now, they rolled back out of Georgia. Maybe Putin will roll back out of the rest of Ukraine, although it certainly doesn't look like that type of operation at the moment. But why didn't we know this already after the 2008 invasion of Georgia?
Well, Bob Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, said a few years ago, we have a perfect record of predicting the next, the next invasion or the next war. He said, we've never been right. And so until, look, I was on the 2014 Strategy Commission that reviewed the Department of Defense's plans, and their assumption was that Europe was going to be a net security provider. In other words, that European security was not going to be threatened. As of 2013, we didn't have a working tank in Europe. And Putin engaged in his first aggression against Ukraine in 2014.
Right.
That's not entirely a coincidence, Ed.
I agree.
The enemy gets a vote about when you fight a war, or another way to put this, it only takes one side to start a war, and when you're weak, you invite aggression. So this is why President Trump talked about peace through strength. We want to be prepared for every plausible risk, and then it's much less likely the risks are going to be realized, and we're not. So let's get ready. Okay, that's what I would suggest, and that's the best chance we have of deterring the aggressors.
Senator Talent, we got about a minute left. I've been arguing for the last, since prior to the election, that low energy prices based on accelerated American production was the main containment vehicle for Putin, and that cutting back American production would allow Putin off the leash. Am I correct? Is that really what happened here?
You are, because preparations against kinetic aggression are the foundation of a policy, but they're not the policy. Okay, so then they give economic tools time to work. And you're talking about a really important part of the overall policy and plan, which is to weaken Russia, but because they get most of their revenue from extractive industries, from oil, basically, and oil-related. So, yes, that's an important part of the policy. And going forward, we ought to be producing. There's no question about that. But at the same time, you have to be able to deter outright aggression, to give time and space and power for those tools to work.
Indeed. And Senator Jim Talent, now Senior Fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, thanks again for joining us. When we come back, we're going to have more analysis of this. Josh Rogin from the Washington Post, Josh Kraushaar from the National Journal will be joining us in the next hour, so please stay tuned. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh Hewitt. Welcome back. This is Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com. Coming to you live from the ReliefFactor.com studio, filling in for Hugh on the Hugh Hewitt Show. We are talking about, all day long today, we are talking about the war that Russia has launched in Ukraine. This is a full version war. This is mechanized land, sea, air operations across the entirety of Ukraine. This is a war of aggression. It is a war of conquest, and it is clearly something that has not been deterred, at least so far, by efforts in the West. Diplomatic and economic deterrents have not worked. We have to ask ourselves then, what is it that Vladimir Putin actually expects to get out of this? What is it that he wants? Joining us to discuss that and other aspects, including what China's response was this morning, is Josh Rogin. He's a Washington Post columnist, a skilled analyst at Foreign Affairs. You can find him on Twitter at Josh Rogin. Josh, thanks for coming on this morning.
Yeah, good morning, Ed.
Always great to talk to you, and especially in very unclear situations like this. And I've been asking myself this question, and I've been asking it on the air. What is it that Vladimir Putin thinks he's going to gain above the costs that are going to come from a full-scale invasion? And at least he seems to be saying an occupation of Ukraine, and maybe even a full annexation of Ukraine back into Russia. I mean, these are the types of things that he's hinting at. This is not a low-cost operation. He has to see some benefit on the other side of this. What do you think that is?
I mean, if we just listen to what Vladimir Putin says, it's pretty clear that what he wants is to destroy the post-Cold War international order that we've been constructing for the last 35 years. I mean, that's essentially a big picture what he has to gain. He is, yes, torturing the people of Ukraine. He has an interest in keeping instability on his near abroad for his own security purposes. There's energy reasons. There's financial reasons. Mostly he's doing it to screw with the entire world and to reassert Russia's place as the country that's screwing with the entire world. And that's exactly what he's done. And that's sort of why I think, for the last few months, and I've been trying to say this as much as possible, that our policy has been totally screwed up because it's all focused on trying to get inside some sort of calculation about oligarchs and banking regulations and all this other Nord Stream 2 pipeline, as if any of those things is on any level near the idea that Vladimir Putin keeps telling us. If someone shows you who they are, just believe them. That
Right.
What he wants to do is to make Russia the most destructive, annoying, aggressive power on that land, on that supercontinent. That's what he's done today.
And I think that there's obviously some benefit to this, but I mean, Russia has benefited economically from engagement with the West. Some of that's going to come to a screeching halt, and that's going to impact some of the people who've been supporting Putin all these years. I mean, you've got a better look at this probably than I do. What is the status of Vladimir Putin's internal support? Has he really consolidated power to the point where the oligarchs don't matter, that the economic connections no longer matter, that their ability to put it bluntly, to launder money in the West, which is probably likely to evaporate now, that no longer matters to him? He's secure enough to where he doesn't have to worry about those things any longer.
I think he's priced all of that in to this plan, okay? And, another sort of weird dystopian disconnect between our discussion of foreign policy in the West and what is actually going on in Moscow. And I was in the Munich Security Conference all last weekend, and all of these European American officials, debating over, do we sanction this oligarch or that oligarch, or do we do it on Tuesday or Wednesday? And it just seems so bizarre to me because, of course, Vladimir Putin doesn't care about any of that. And, that doesn't mean it doesn't cost him something, but it just means he doesn't care. So it's not going to move him, and it was never going to deter him, and still not going to deter him. And, we have all of this crazy talking past each other in Washington, like, oh, well, was that oligarch sanctioned under this executive order? Because that's really going to get Putin's, attention, and no, and we're fooling ourselves, and we're telling ourselves a story about the way things work in Russia now that's not anchored to any sort of reality that we can see on our TV screens. And, that's all because we're not willing to discuss the things that we could actually do that could actually change the situation. These are the things that the Ukrainians are asking us for, have been asking us for, and this means more armaments, more advanced armaments, more security commitments. In other words, we're responding to a security move with an economic lever, and it doesn't make any sense, and it certainly doesn't make any sense for Putin. And what the Ukrainians are saying, no, we have to use security adjustments in order to respond to a security change, and that involves not just the movement of troops, but like real, actual security support for Ukraine. Do you remember what happened in 2008 when Putin attacked Georgia?
Yes.
Heading towards Tbilisi. President George W. Bush flew American U.S. Air Force planes onto the runways in Tbilisi, humanitarian missions, he called them, and then Putin demanded he take the planes away, and he said, no, F you, they're staying there, and you better not attack them, and Putin stopped, okay? That is an example of a security adjustment that actually made an impact on Putin because he had to recalculate the cost of what he was doing in Tbilisi was saved. Okay, now, I'm not saying that applies directly here in the same exact way. I'm just saying if you want to talk about influencing Putin, that's the realm of influencing Putin, not like trying to attack his oligarch's son in his, Cyprus Bank, which obviously Putin doesn't care about at all.
It's an interesting point you raise because they've been going after the airfields almost from the get-go, which, militarily would make sense anyway. But certainly it would also make sense to preempt a similar move to protect Kiev, right, by parking some American airplanes on the tarmac there. That is, I would imagine the window for that has pretty much closed, though, at this point.
Yeah, but that's what, when you talk to the Ukrainians, they keep saying, well, the reason these windows keep closing is you keep not doing anything. So,
right.
They wanted Patriots. And I talked to the Biden officials about that. They're like, well, that would take months to train them on the Patriots. So I'm like, why didn't you do it months ago? And then they're like, oh, well, we want the good radar, not the bad radar, because the good radar doesn't allow you to, actually fight the Russians. It only allows you to see what's in front of you. They're like, oh, well, that's going to take several months to deliver. Well, why didn't you do it several months ago? So, yeah, we are where we are because we've neglected this for so long, and we whistled past the graveyard, and that's what we did. We told ourselves a story that Putin wouldn't dare do this. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians who were in this position were like, hey, just in case, can we have a bunch of stuff to actually protect ourselves, and that stuff still hasn't come. But, okay, so what can we do now? Okay, well, we can't put U.S. planes on the runway, obviously. That seems like a terrible idea at this moment. What about logistics trains? What about, making sure that if this war goes on for months, that they have a steady supply of the things that we are willing to give them, even if it's just ammunition, even if it's just Javelin missiles. You guys see how many Russian tanks were flowing in? They're going to need a lot more anti-tank missiles, anti-missile weapons, anti-aircraft weapons, Stingers. We're parsing them out like they're expensive or something. It's crazy. Okay, and then when the president gets on the TV today, what's he going to say? Oh yeah, we're going to punish that oligarch son in London, and that's really over the long term going to change everything. And the Ukrainians are like, hey, we're dying right now. Can we have some help right now?
We're speaking with Josh Rogin of the Washington Post. Your colleague Christian Shepard wrote this morning about China's reaction to this. We got maybe about a minute and a half here, Josh. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing out of China as well, and what it means, what it doesn't mean, maybe, for what Vladimir Putin is doing.
Right. Well, the Chinese government's reaction has been all over the map, to be clear. Okay, they're for Ukraine's sovereignty, but they're for Russia's grievances, and they're also for diplomacy, but they're also supporting the idea of the invasion. So it doesn't make any sense on its face. And that's where Chinese foreign policy is right now, okay? It's essentially a set of, lies and strongmen. And I don't say that lightly. If they want to have a foreign policy that's based on sovereignty and territorial integrity, then they would stand up to an invasion of Ukraine, and they're not doing it. And when they look at Taiwan, they don't see Ukraine because they don't think of Taiwan as another country. They think of it as their territory, but it's not exact parallel. So this has torn the Chinese up in knots. They don't really know what to do, but in their flailing, what we've learned is that what they say is not what they mean, and that in the end, all of their principles will fold when they're put to a choice between supporting their thuggish ally Vladimir Putin, which is essentially where they've fallen down.
Well, and this is exactly where it's at. Now, this is not something that China is going to get involved in. Clearly, they're basically staying out of this. We're going to be continuing to watch for more developments on this. Josh Rogin, I know that you're going to be looking at this long and hard over the next several days. We're going to look forward to what you're writing at the Washington Post on it. Thank you so much for joining us. When we come back, we'll talk more about what's going on in the United States, about responses to this, as Josh said, mostly not effective. I'm Ed Morrissey from filling in for Hugh Hewitt. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, coming to you live from the ReliefFactor.com Studios Texas edition, filling in for Hugh today on the Hugh Hewitt Show, and we are going wall to wall about the war in Ukraine. I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. American policy on Russia has been feckless for many years, and there, across presidencies of both parties, Vladimir Putin's territorial ambitions have been consistently underestimated. As Josh Rogin said earlier this hour, this is something that we haven't had the right context for what it is that Vladimir Putin's ambitions actually are. And this is a wake-up call that has actually happened more than once. And it happened in 2008 in Georgia when the scales fell off the eyes of George W. Bush, who thought that Putin was a rational partner for a constructive engagement between Russia and the West. It happened in 2014. And it's happening today. It's been happening in Ukraine ever since 2014. I mean, you can just count every single day for the last 8 years, almost to the day, as a object lesson in Vladimir Putin's ambitions. But, back in 2012, I want to bring this up because first off, we've got a clip about this, but I want to bring this up and I want to set the stage for this. In the 2012 presidential election, the subject of Russia came up because earlier in the year, it came up in a presidential debate, actually. Earlier in the year, Mitt Romney had said that Russia was our number one geopolitical foe. They were the greatest danger, and Mitt Romney was excoriated over this. Barack Obama ridiculed him, saying the 80s called, they want their foreign policy back. Actually, we have Josh Kraushaar on the line, so let's bring in Josh because I want to find out what's going on in Washington, D.C. now that the scales apparently have fallen off some eyes there as well. Josh Kraushaar, National Journal, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Ed. Good to be with you.
Well, Josh, it's great to talk to you today, and we've been talking a lot about the various reactions here abroad. Boris Johnson had a good speech this morning. Jens Stoltenberg, NATO. You've got declarations from Turkey, surprisingly calling Russia's actions unlawful and unjust. Unlawful and unjust, and so. What's going on in Washington? What are you seeing there in terms of what the response is going to be inside the Beltway from members of both parties in the administration?
Well, look, I think it's fair to conclude that the Biden administration has united the West, united the NATO allies in trying to formulate some kind of response. Sanctions, we'll hear more from President Biden later today, but there is a resolve among the NATO allies, and the White House has gotten some credit for at least coordinating what was once a dysfunctional group of countries that didn't really have a consensus on how to deal with Russia's aggressiveness. And, Russia made it easy. Their invasion of Ukraine in the last 48 hours has really also toughened the resolve of our Western allies. But the next question is, where do we go from here, and what are the political options for the Biden administration?
Well, what are the options here? I know that we're talking about a lot tougher sanctions than have been said before. In previous discussions, exclusion from the SWIFT banking system had been discussed, but opposed largely on the basis of European resistance to that, because they do a lot of business with Russia, and it would have complicated the remittances in their import-export with Russia. Is that back on the table, do you think? I mean, what are you hearing specifically that these sanctions might include?
Yeah, I'm not hearing that's going to be on the table today, but we'll have to hear from the president at noon today. But that's where the politics get tricky, especially in Europe, where energy prices are likely to soar. We're going to see a similar effect in the United States. And, we saw how difficult it was for Germany to break loose from the Nord Stream pipeline. They finally, at the last minute, as Russia was just about to invade Ukraine, ended up canceling or suspending the pipeline. But there was a political imperative in Europe to have cheaper gas, cheaper energy, and that's really created a challenge in trying to get the Europeans on the same page, because their domestic audience, while concerned of what's going on in Ukraine, also has shorter term self-interest at play in terms of their pocketbooks.
We're speaking with Josh Kraushaar, National Journal. There's a report from the New York Times out here that the EU is preparing the harshest package of sanctions that they've ever implemented, but some of the states in Europe, led by Germany apparently, don't want to include Vladimir Putin on that. Now, there had been indications that the Biden administration had considered and then decided against sanctioning Putin directly and personally. Do you think that that's back in the mix now, or do you think that they're going to follow Germany's lead and leave that as like a diplomatic negotiating point?
Well, that's part of the problem. We hear the sanctions reflex used all the time. The question is, who's being sanctioned, how tough, and how muscular are these sanctions? I think one area that I'm going to be watching closely for is all these kids of oligarchs or relatives of oligarchs that are investing in Europe and the United States, that have kids studying abroad, that have, a lot of financial, wherewithal in Western countries. What will happen to them? What will happen to their money? I think that would at least provide some muscle from the United States and our European allies to Russia, where it hurts, where it really could have some impact. Right now, it just seems like, up to this point, it's been more of a tit for tat. And these sanctions don't seem to be doing anything to prevent Putin and Russia from invading Ukraine.
This is something that Josh Rogin raised earlier this hour, Josh, and I wanted to ask you, and again, we're talking to Josh Kraushaar just to make sure that everybody keeps the names straight. If you adjust your scorecards, we're talking to Josh Kraushaar now. But Rogin was saying earlier in the hour that all of these sanctions really missed the mark. They missed the point that Putin isn't going to be moved by sanctions. His project is to completely reorder the world back into a bipolar or tripolar superpower division of power based on brute force, based on the ability to field brute force. And Rogin was saying that maybe that's the only response that we can actually give is to escalate the brute force capabilities of NATO to make it clear that that Putin is going to lose in that calculation.
Well, coming from Josh, I mean that's a scary proposition. That you have this revanchist Putin regime that's looking to turn back the clock a generation. We don't see that very often in geopolitics. And that's also the challenge is the United States and our NATO allies, without putting actual military forces in Ukraine, which is off the table.
Right.
Russia's always going to have the upper hand in setting the tone of this invasion. Now, I think giving money to Ukraine to purchase weapons, giving military assets to Ukraine, that will make any Russian invasion, occupation more difficult. I think it'll be difficult no matter what. It'll be interesting to see how far or how long Russia goes, Putin goes. Does he really want to slice off a part of eastern Ukraine, or is this an occupation of the entire country? So ultimately, Putin has set in the tone here. He set in the agenda. I think the best we can do at this point, the U.S. or NATO allies, is to give money, military resources, hardware to Ukraine to make Russia's task more difficult. And the fact that Germany, I know, has a law in the book. They don't give military assets to other countries, or dating back to World War II or that time period. That may have to change. I mean, we're in a brave new world right now, and I think a lot of the Europeans' diplomacy first postures are proving to be not up to the task in fighting back against Putin.
I think that they've discovered now, belatedly, that this isn't really a diplomacy issue. It hasn't been probably for some time. This is a balance of power issue. And again, I think we're out of practice in balance of power issues, especially in Europe. And I think that there was this idea that we had gotten past that in 1990. And even though we probably should have woken up to that in 2008 and 2014, the moment is now upon us. Do you see that realization among leading Republicans and Democrats in Washington at the moment?
Well, there's an interesting. I mean, the politics of this are going to be interesting. There are Republicans that are largely united, standing with Ukraine. Aside from some, what I never would have imagined you'd have even, a small number of voices ostensibly being pro-Putin. Tucker Carlson, J.D. Vance, the Senate candidate in Ohio, some of the far right fringe in the House, but largely the Republicans are united. Democrats are largely, even the dovish Democrats. Bernie Sanders came out with a pretty muscular statement a couple days ago supporting Ukraine. So there is unity right now. I mean, the challenge is what happens when gas prices go up in this country. The Republican instinct also is going to be to blame Biden for being weak. That's gonna come up more and more as time goes on. So in the past we've always seen sort of bipartisan unity when it comes to foreign affairs, standing with our allies. We're in a very fractured country, Ed, and I'm worried that bipartisanship, that consensus is going to strain as time goes on.
Well, I think you're right, and I think that we've seen that already sort of in the run-up before the tanks rolled, right? Where there was a lot of debate about this. There was a lot of debate as to just how involved we should be with Ukraine. There's been a lot of blaming of the U.S. for provoking this, Josh, and I think that's also things that are going to play out in the political realm. And I know that people are going to be able to follow that at Josh Kraushaar for National Journal, nationaljournal.com, where he writes his column. Josh, thank you so much for being with us, and best of luck keeping up with this story.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me.
So Josh Kraushaar, at Josh Kraushaar on Twitter. He's very active on Twitter, so you can follow what he's doing there. Coming up next, Hugh Hewitt returns for a segment here with Charlie Dombeck, CEO of Key City Capital. I'll be back with you tomorrow, live from the ReliefFactor.com studios, Texas edition. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh. We'll talk to you then.